Finding common percentages. Starting with 200. 200 will represent the original number, so that's 100%. To find 10%, we divide this by 10. Dividing this by 10 moves the decimal over till we get 20, so we'll put the 20 here. Again, do not put the 20 over there. Don't line up the twos. Okay, furthermore, to get 5%, you take half of your 10% answer. So half of our 20 will be 10. Or should I say 20 divided by 2 will be 10. Now, to get a 15%, we take our 10% answer and our 5% answer and we add them together. So if I take my 20 and my 10 here, add them together, I'll get 30. And 30 will represent 15%. In order to get 20%, I need to go back to my 10% and double it. So if my 10% is 20 and I double that, that'll become 40. Okay, let's do this again. All right, our original number is 20, that's 100%. I want 10% of it. So to find 10%, I need to move my decimal over one time, which is dividing 20 by 10. So dividing 20 by 10 will give me 2. Do not put the 2 here, but instead put the 2 there. And that's your 10%. Now to find 5%, you take half of your 10% answer. So, or divided by 2. So, half of 2, or should I say 2 divided by 2, will be 1. So 1 represents 5%. Now to get a 15%, we need to add our 10% and our 5% numbers together. My 10% number is 2, my 5% number is 1, so when you add those together, you'll get 3. So 3 will represent 15%. Okay, to get 20%, you go back to your 10% and you double your 10%. So 10% times 2 should give us our 20%. So 2 times 2, which gives us 4. And 4 represents 20%. Now, let's do 300. 300 is our original number. We want 10% of that, so we're going to divide 300 by 10. This will give us 30. We'll write our 30 here. Again, careful not to write your 30 here. All right, so next I need 5%. 5% is half of 10%. So if 10% is 30, half of 30 will be 15. Now, I want 15%. To get 15%, you take your 10% and your 5% and you add them together. My 10% is 30, my 5% is 15. So when I add these together, we're going to get 45. And that represents 15%. Now, if you want 20%, you go back to your 10% and you double it, or should I say multiply it by 2. So my 10% is 30. If I multiply that by 2, I will get 60. And that's my 20%. Okay, now we're here at 30. That's 100%. If I want 10%, I divide this by 10. So my decimal will move from here to here, which gives me a 3. Do not put the 3 here. The 3 goes there. That is 10%. Now, to find 5%, I need to take half of 10%. 3 is an odd number, so it makes it a little more difficult to find half of 3. So what we're going to do is add a decimal here and a 0. And now we'll be taking half of 30. Half of 30 will be 15, and the decimal still resides here in the middle. And so this is our 5%, 1.5. To find 15%, you take your 10% answer and your 5% answer and you add them. So I'm going to take my 3.0, add it to my 1.5, and this will give us 4.5 for 15%. To find 20%, you go back up to your 10% and you double it or multiply by 2. So if our 10% is 3, when you multiply that by 2, 3 times 2 will give us 6. We don't necessarily need the decimal and zero anymore. If you put it in, it's okay, but we don't need it anymore because we're not trying to take half of the number. Okay, so 400. That's 100%. Let's take 10%, which moves the decimal over and gives us 40. So 40 will be 10%. I want 5%. 5% will be half of 10%. So half of 40 will be 20. Or should I say we divide that by 2. To get 15% of the 400, we have to add our 10% and our 5% together. So that's adding 40 and 20. That will give us 60. And so that'll be 15%. To get 20%, we need to double our 10%. So if our 10% is 40, doubling that will give us 80. Or should I say multiplying by 2. Now next, a 25%. A 25% is actually the combination of the 5% and the 20%. So if I combine or add my 5% and my 20%, I'll get my 25%. So I'll be adding my 20 and my 80. When I add my 20 and 80, that should be 100. So we'll put 100 here. And that represents 25%. Now, to get 50%, we take half of the 100%, which is 400. So if I take half of 400, or should I say divided by 2, we're going to get 200. And finally, to get our 75%, we can get 75% by adding our 25% and our 50% together, which means we'll be adding our 100 and our 200 together, which will combine to be 300.